Well, my name is Sarah Wenner, and I'm here as one of the Mellon Curatorial Fellows. I'm going to briefly introduce our next two speakers. I'm so honored to welcome to the stage Björn Anderson. Björn is an associate professor of art history at the University of Iowa, a specialist in the study of material, cultural, and visual interaction in the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. His work explores ancient identity, political memory, and cross-cultural interactions. A trained archaeologist, he has excavated in both Israel and Jordan. His current field project uses photogrammetry and 3D modeling to reconstruct a tomb facade in Petra, Jordan. Please help me in welcoming Björn.
Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be here in Cincinnati, to see the new gallery. I am honored to be invited to speak to you today. I was last here in 2003 in conjunction with the Petra Lost City of Stone exhibition, and the new space is breathtaking. Congratulations for putting it all together. I'd like to thank Ainsley and Emily and Julia and Sarah for inviting me, coordinating all the logistics, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for the generous financial support. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone here. I noted on the website the event is sold out, which is wonderful to see. I thank you for supporting CAM. And also, after 2 years of teaching on Zoom, that is the cat named Frankenstein there. It is invigorating to see so many of you here today. This is my first kind of public appearance in about 2 years. Now, before I begin the talk, I want to abuse my position in front of the microphone to make a follow-up comment to Morag Kersel's excellent talk yesterday. In the Q&A afterwards, the issue of Western Museum safeguarding the cultural heritage of other countries, mainly those in Asia and Africa, was raised, which Morag rightly contextualized as perpetuation of colonialism. Yes, yes, yes. But I'd like to emphasize the racism embedded in this issue. The underlying logic, after all, is that black and brown people aren't capable of taking care of their past, or their present for that matter. We need to name this aloud. And Morag, thank you for your inclusion of the land use acknowledgement from DePaul. Here's Iowa's statement. I also work from a position of privilege in an institution established on the homelands of a number of dispossessed tribes and tribal nations. As you noted yesterday, actions such as donations are more meaningful than words, but the words matter. And acknowledgement is key, and actually that's a lot of the heart of my talk today. Spoiler alert. But we need to get there first. So, my paper then explores the sculptural fragments from Khirbet et-Tannur, which are mainly represented by the architectural reliefs that adorned a hilltop sanctuary about 100 kilometers north of the city of Petra. Oh, yes, right. My 8-year-old daughter and my 14-year-old son were home with me the last 2 years. We spent a lot of time on Photoshop. So, pointers, yes. Here is the distance to Petra. If you're walking, I guess it's 20 hours. I have not tried. So for the sake of today's paper, I'm presupposing a little bit of familiarity with the works, many of which are displayed in the gallery upstairs. And if you'd like to know more about them, as well as the Cincinnati-born excavator, Nelson Glick, I suggest the excellent essay by Sarah Wenner in the Seeing History Anew catalog, that accompanies the event. I'm going to focus on their place in Nabataean art, and in my text, by the way, Nabataean is in quotes, and I'll explain that a little bit more momentarily. But first, a few brief facts to ground the discussion. Number one, the sculpture was added during the final phase of the complex and dates to the 2nd century CE, after the annexation of Arabia by the Roman Empire, which took place in 106. Secondly, the identification of the figures, i.e., is this Hadad, is this Dushara, is probably best kept loose, i.e., as polysemic representations of the hybrid gods, again, quotes, that were so often represented in the Roman East. Broadly speaking, most Mediterranean and Near Eastern religions involved a supreme sky god and his consort, a fertility goddess, as well as their offspring. The specific names of the gods were negotiable and probably less important. Winner's thoughtful consideration of this issue is worth a careful read. Number 3, Tannur was just a sanctuary on the top of a distinctive conical hill. People didn't live there. Locals lived in the nearby village of Khirbet at Dariyah, which was expanded about the same time as Tannur. The temple at Dariyah also produced a number of sculptural fragments. These include an impressive series of architectural reliefs that represented figures from the zodiac, as well as a few other recognizable Mediterranean figures. Tannur, therefore, was probably a destination for pilgrims celebrating annual festivals. Point 4, the sculptural style represented here and at Dariyah is different from much of the sculpture at Petra. Villeneuve, who excavated the temple at Dariyah, calls them provincial, which is, I think, a nice way to say poorly executed. But Mackenzie and others have rightly noted that the apparent clumsiness is instead a deliberate stylization and simplification, akin to that observed in Syrian context. Note as well the beautiful and elaborate borders and floral decorations. There should be no question that these were skilled sculptors. I often think, actually, of borders and patterns as spaces where artists show off their technical mastery. Take a close look at the Greek painted pots upstairs. At Petra, there is greater stylistic affinity to the Mediterranean, particularly as observed in the earlier, quote, 1967 group of sculpture, a group of reliefs that again represent mainly Greek divinities. Note the deep-set eyes, the round, full chin, the parted lips, the expressive features. So the sculptural identity of Nabataean is a complex issue, and I'm very thankful that I can punt this to Lamia, who is presenting next. Point 5, the Nabataean religion, quotes being used around religion, is also a problematic concept, but it was rooted in the Semitic traditions, at least in part, that restricted divine images. There are 100 of rock-cut betels, or aniconic blocks, at Petra and other Nabataean sites. These blocks most often represented the great god Dushara, whose name is really a title, the god of the Shara Mountains. Now there was obviously not a prohibition against graven images, however. The so-called block and medallion relief from Petra shows the figural and aniconic traditions coexisting side by side, or top and bottom, I guess. Even as some passersby may have preferred the betel, they did not engage in iconoclasm. The medallion was left undamaged until modern times. And here, just to see where this is, we have another pointer from medieval manuscripts here. So this relief, I think, speaks eloquently in favor of understanding Nabataean religion as a spectrum of approaches and practices, and I generally avoid using the word religion, by the way, which is so tied to formalized and codified systems in most ancient contexts, preferring something more fluid like cultic activity. And I note to my students frequently that belief usually is generally less important than practice in most ancient contexts, which is a helpful point when considering how and why these different traditions could coexist in a seemingly non-problematic composition. So hopefully this is enough background to kind of get us going. What I want to drill into today is the question of being Nabataean. And we can already see that the sculptures from Tannur raise a number of issues and show just how muddy this problem is. Indeed, the fact that the sculptures post-date the Roman annexation of Arabia has led many scholars, myself included, to omit them from a study of Nabataean identity. If the Nabataean kingdom no longer exists, well, then these can't be Nabataean work. Have the Nabataeans become Romans? Have they become Nabato-Romans? Ugh. If there's no Nabataea, no Nabataeans, is this Nabataean art, right? These sorts of questions start to spiral out of control. Now, the answer, of course, is yes, these are Nabataean art, but getting past the hurdles is challenging. When it comes to identity, there are no constants. Everything is ultimately variable and really boils down to the individual. Talking about cultural identity, therefore, can feel discouraging, even pointless, and I've always loved this quote by Michael McDonald, and he's right to steer us away from ethnicity as a marker of identity, by the way. It doesn't have to be this way, though, hence the title of my paper. We can weigh anchor, we can set sail if we keep a few obvious things in mind and approach the material with a conscious honesty. More on that in a moment. Let me just give a little bit of kind of background here. It might be helpful to just tell you a little bit about how I got from point A to point B, so where I started and where I am now. I've been interested in the Nabataeans since the late 1990s. I discovered them, specifically the pottery, as a MA student at the University of British Columbia. And I was then captivated by the question of Nabataean identity during my PhD work at Michigan from 2000 to 2005. It was, and Lindsay, maybe this is of interest to you, it was during Margaret Root's class on the art of ancient Iran that I connected the crenellations and the rosettes that dominate Achaemenid art at Persepolis and Susa, and I hope this bowl is authentic. There's a paper trail at least. Here you can see at Susa as well. Connected them with the prominence of these motifs on Nabataean funerary architecture at Petra. At first, my concern was with sort of liberating the Nabataeans from what I saw as the tyranny of the Khazna and the predominantly Rome-centered perspective that I frequently encountered in studies from the 1970s and 1990s. In particular, it was the maps that drew my ire, maps that all too often placed Petra in the bottom right corner, so they could also include Rome. So my first attempt to recenter the Nabataeans was this now quaintly pixelated map that I produced for my 2002 article in Ars Orientalis, and this illustration which anchored Nabatea right in the middle. And I got very excited that Persepolis is actually closer than Rome. Through this, I suggested maybe a potential aspect of resistance, a conscious employment of visual traditions of Eastern empires as symbolic opposition to the expansion of Rome. I went on to write a dissertation then on Nabataean identity, which I completed in 2005, and I decided to restrict my Nabatea, as I noted, to those years when it was a kingdom, when it could be kind of defined. To look at material dating before the Roman annexation of Arabia in 106 CE. After this, it became Nabataean Roman and just frankly too messy to deal with, which meant Khirbet et-Tannur was too late. For my definition of Nabataean, this hilltop sanctuary and associated sculptural program was established after the Roman conquest. And by the way, Stefan Schmidt, who I admire greatly, in his 2021 article on Nabataean identity, maintains the distinction, saying that while these monuments may offer further insights into the first steps of the Roman administration in organizing the new province, they probably tell us less about Nabataean identities. So, poor Tannur, it's always too late to be relevant. Anyway, even as I worked on my dissertation, I was already starting to get, doubts were creeping in about the broad concept itself. By this point, I was aware that identity was variable, often plural, ultimately coming down to individual views of self and others. So talking about some kind of Nabataean, quotes again, right, identity, therefore, felt positivistic, it felt forced. There was always this yes, but in the back of my head. And the voice is still there, and the voice is right. So let's outline these problems correctly. I like pointers, I also like lists. So a few quick points. Identity is contextual. Individuals need to align with or against others, right? And so it's ultimately bound to the definition of groups. I usually explain cultural identity to my students as a claim of membership in a group or a subgroup. And without going too far off the side here, I'll note that claiming identity doesn't need to be conscious, it doesn't need to be deliberate. Sometimes our identities are forced on us by outsiders who make our claims for us. I'm happy to follow up on these in the Q&A. But second, defining groups necessitates generalizing, and we know this is bad. But we do it all the time, and we have to. The Roman Empire does exist. There were Romans, even if kind of the idea of Roman is flawed. And I should note my indebtedness to the whole conversation on Romanization that's been taking place since probably the 80s. The Theoretical Roman Archaeology Conference in England always produces really interesting papers about these questions. So third, of course, Group making often favors the privileged, and it obscures minority voices, especially antiquity, when pretty much all of our art, I'm going to not talk about domestic architecture, but things like that, but art is the product of elites. That's what survives. Along with this, cultural containers or bounded entities aren't very helpful. I like this phrase, which I borrow from John Miguel Versluis, cultural containers. Roman is this kind of jar that we put these things in. They're not terribly helpful. And trying to look at all the, disciplinary boundaries aren't helpful either. And I note this, I think we all are aware. Upstairs, for example, because of the building and this historic structure, the Middle East and Egypt, Greece, and Rome are separate, right? These kind of disciplinary boundaries are there and they're real, but they're problematic. Trying to look at all the details doesn't work either. What I mean there is that everything does boil down to the individual, but it's not very useful. It's too granular, right? We can't look at every individual Roman or Nabataean or Nabata Roman or something like that. We have to kind of come up with these groups, but it's always sort of wrong to do that. And so I've always grappled with that issue. And finally, using quotes as qualifiers gets really tiresome. And I wanted to add this quote from yesterday from our speaker, that none of our communities are monoliths. I really liked that observation. So for me, one way I've kind of resolved this for myself is with what I think of as scalar thinking. And I took this from studies on land use and mapping that I did as a graduate student. And the basic principle here is that in mapping, things can be true at one level, and yet we know it's false at another. So depending on scale, details are omitted or included, right? Maps are useless, and I'll put these two next to each other, when kind of the small details overwhelm and obscure the important information. Simplification is necessary, it's acceptable. Similarly, some features like roads are exaggerated, they're bigger, that's the point of the slides here, to make them appear meaningfully visible. So here is an example, right? Here is the road, but actually, if we look at it when we kind of zoom our map in or out, the road gets very, very big. And we know this, and we do this all the time, and we're comfortable with it. We know we're looking at something that is not really true, but we're okay with it. So for me, employing this kind of scalar thinking allows me to engage messy issues, which I know are false, like Romanization or Hellenization. These ideas, again, untangled in the 1990s, but especially because they fail when we zoom in and we start looking at individual case studies. The models always fall apart. But when we zoom back out, we can see it does occur in a general sense. Theaters are built, wine is consumed, things like that, right? So it's a strange balance, I think. We do it unconsciously. We need to generalize to make sense of things, but we know we're not being completely honest when we do. I don't know another way to manage collective identity. There were no, quote, Nabataeans, but there were trends, ideas, practices that can be largely understood as Nabataean. So that's where my notes end. I kind of scrapped the second half here, or not the second half, second 3 minutes, to respond to some things that really came up yesterday. So solution one, scalar thinking. Solution two, mindfulness. And as somebody with ADHD, I know all about mindfulness and trying to focus on the moment. And this involves kind of intentional awareness, dispassionate observation, and acceptance and commitment. And I think that these are things we do now and we can and should apply to how we look at antiquity. This photo, by the way, was a plant, I think it was rosemary growing in our kitchen last year, and watching it every day and watching the little leaves curl and thinking about that, deliberately and slowly was helpful. And I'm teaching Greek pot painting right now, and one of my students, most all of our preserved Greek pot paintings, Greek painted vessels, anything that's complete comes from an Etruscan tomb in Italy. And every time in class we start talking about what these pot paintings mean for Greek society, one of my students, Quinn, will always say, yes, but Etruscan tombs, right? Like, what do we really know about what these say about Greece? Because they're all from Etruscan tombs. And so, I like the yes, but. I think that's important, and to be mindful of that anytime we're looking at Greek pottery. And then the third solution to this is just honesty and humility when we approach this material in our scholarship and in our thinking, that we need to name these problems to ourselves, but also we need to acknowledge bias in structures and systems, seek out the alternative voices, and pay attention to nuance. And also that integrity really does matter here, right, with things like provenance. That we need to be very transparent about these things and put the problems out there. And I love this example from the Ashmolean Museum. Michael Vickers, who has always been a poker of things. The current caption here says, Attic red figure stemmed pottery cup depicting a courting scene. And the original caption that John Beasley came up with was a erotic man and youth with bag, walking stick, sponge, auribulos, and strigil suspended. And for about 10 years, the caption was pedophile and victim. And I think that's great. We need to do more things like this, in my view. And I realize I get sort of preachy here when I get into what we should do, so I'll acknowledge that. So the other thing, the final point I'll just make here, I had this setting sail analogy, and then I started to think, what have I anchored myself to? And then all of a sudden it kind of worked again for me, and I thought, oh, this is really good. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But what anchors Khirbet et-Tannur? What are the assumptions that kind of bind us here, right? Things about bounded entities, colonialist views of the Arabs, in quotes, right? Links to the Nabataean kingdom, all these sorts of things. We can't just cut the ropes. I would argue we need to pull up the anchor, right, if we're going to move forward, move on. And actually, and this is where it really started to work for me, and I will add in, I think this is Trajan, isn't it? Yes, Trajan here. I like these ships where the anchor is hanging and visible. I think this is what we need to do. We need to hang the anchor proudly. It's big, it's ugly, but hiding it is as bad as staying anchored. We need to be reminded of our anchors to see that we've pulled them up, and then finally we can set sail. And I would like to commend again Sarah, if you haven't read her catalog entry, the tension and the struggle where she says, I really don't want to identify these gods, but I'm going to, but it's a problem. This is, I think, the right approach. This is a model of what we should be doing. So I want to just commend you, Sarah. We are doing this, I think, all the time in our present contexts, as we think about race, as we think about gender identity, things like that. We can do it in the past, too. And of course, it's happening, but I really want to advocate for that. So finally, then, we'll let Kos take off, set sail. Thank you all very much, and apologies for all the dad jokes.